My name is Jason Carpenter, Jasoncarpenter.
Good morning, Mr. Carpenter.
Good morning, sir.
Now, to be clear, I understand that in March of 2014, you were working as a sergeant for the Albuquerque Police Department.
Yes, sir.
And at that time, and during that month, you responded to a call involving James Boyd.
Yes, sir.
Now, before we go there, I'd like to just talk a little bit about your background so the jury has a sense of who you are. I understand you graduated from Albuquerque High School, is that correct?
Yes, sir, in 1997.
Now, one of the things about the microphone, if you could just come a little closer to the microphone so that everyone can hear you, and if I do the same, I hope I'm told that I need to speak much more loudly. Now, after graduating from high school, I understand you enlisted in the United States Army.
I did.
And what was your military occupational specialty?
At the time, it was called combat medic.
And how many years were you enlisted in the United States Army?
4 years active duty and 6 years in the Army National Guard here in New Mexico.
Now, there came a time, I think in 2005, in which you became an Albuquerque Police Department officer.
Yes, sir.
And why did you choose to become an Albuquerque Police Department officer?
One, because of the paramilitary organization. When I got off active duty, I missed that. In the Army, I developed some close relationships, and the camaraderie was another reason that I joined the Albuquerque Police Department. And I also think, for me, serving my country and serving my community are, probably as an adult male, something that, it would have been worthwhile for me.
Now, I understand that you're currently on active duty, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, which branch of the military service are you serving in right now?
In the United States Air Force. It's the New Mexico Air National Guard.
So, currently you're not working as an Albuquerque Police Department officer, is that right?
No, sir.
You are on active duty with the Air National Guard.
Yes, I'm on active duty orders.
Now, turning your attention to your career with the Albuquerque Police Department, I believe you began your career in 2005, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And how long did you work as a field services officer?
Approximately 5 years.
And after 5 years, did you begin a promotional process to the rank of sergeant?
Actually, I worked as a narcotics detective for 3 years in Special Investigations Division.
So it's fair to say that you worked as an officer and a detective for 8 years?
Yes, sir.
And after those 8 years, did you begin a testing process for the rank of sergeant?
I did.
Would you please explain the process that you had to undergo in order to become a sergeant with the Albuquerque Police Department?
First, you apply to see if you're even qualified or accepted for the testing process. And then there's a written exam. There's also an assessment center, which sergeants go to prior to the rank of sergeant. If you're able to pass those 3 phases, then you're promoted.
When did you become a sergeant?
It was approximately, I want to say, 2009.
2009?
Yes.
So from
I'm sorry, that was the testing process, and then I spent 3 years in narcotics, and I was promoted in 2012 out of narcotics.
So is it fair to say that you worked as a sergeant for 2 years before the incident involving Mr. Boyd?
Approximately 2 years, yes, sir.
Now, in March of 2014, would you please describe your responsibilities? I guess I first should say, as a sergeant, what was your specific? Where did you specifically work with the Albuquerque Police Department?
As a sergeant, I was first placed in the southeast day shift. After that, there was a bid process, and I ended up bidding to the Foothills Area Command.
Now, is it fair to say that the Foothill Area Command encompasses that area that we know to be the open space on the Sandia Mountains?
Yes, sir.
Now, as a field sergeant in the Foothills Area Command, what are your general responsibilities?
One, being the supervisor, you can supervise anywhere from, I'd say, 7 to, I've had a squad with 14 officers. So supervision. Also, working in the Field Service Bureau, we answer calls for service, which is our primary duty. Also, you do have officers, which kind of proactive policing that are out there stopping vehicles and calling out with subjects, but our primary duty is calls for service.
Now I'd like to talk about the call for service that was made that brought you to the 812 Piedra Vista Road Northeast in March of 2014. Now there's been an awful lot of testimony about the lead up that brought you to the Hill, so I wanted to take you quickly from the time you were dispatched until the time you were on the Hill speaking with Mr. Boyd, with the court's permission. Now, it's about 4:30 when you learn that there is a incident happening in the open space, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And it's about 5:02 p.m. when you learn that a suspect or subject is at gunpoint and the air is 10-3.
Approximately.
Okay. Now, having heard that a subject is at gunpoint and the air is 10-3, what concerns does that raise in your mind?
Several. Safety being number one. I do believe at some point I was informed that they had a subject that was armed with a deadly weapon. Is the reason that they had their knives out or their guns out. So it as a supervisor, it presented several concerns for me. Like I said, safety being number one. Number two, it is our policy. The Albuquerque Police Department has developed that a hard striper start to that area and be on scene.
When you use the term hard striper, what do you mean?
When I mean hard striper, I mean sergeant, the rank of sergeant.
So the Albuquerque Police Department requires that a sergeant respond to critical incidents. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And is that the reason why you went to this particular call?
One reason. Also, I think oftentimes working in the Field Service Bureau, even prior to promotion, and it's also kind of the military way. You're there, to help each other out also. So you're responding there because it's your duty, but also, like I said, develop relationships, being officers, and so you're going to help each other out. And for me, as a supervisor, is to bring some resolve to the situation, peaceful resolution.
Now, there came a point in time in which a number of officers were dispatched to the Piedra Vista address. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, who from your squad was dispatched to this particular call?
It was Chris Wetterland, myself, trying to think who all was there. So, if I may, there was 2 squads working that day. I was, in a sense, supervising both squads. We had another supervisor that was off that day, so I was supervising both squads. So there was other officers there that were in the Foothills Area Command at the time.
And who those other officers?
Those other officers, which weren't directly under me in my squad, but I was supervising that day, was so we had Chris Wetterland, Officer Rogelio, Officer Brock Niprith. There was 2 open space officers that were out there, Officer Hernandez and Officer John McDaniel. We also had Officer Mike Monet was also out there.
And was he one of your officers?
That day, but he wasn't in my squad.
Now, there came a point in time in which you and your fellow officers moved up to a position to make contact with Mr. Boyd. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that happened shortly after 5 o'clock.
Correct.
Now, as you were there and the incident began to develop, would you please explain to the jury that a hard striper, a sergeant, has when they're called to and respond to an incident such as the one with Mr. Boyd?
Well, I know we use, as a supervisor, we'll secure communications so that way nobody's talking over each other, and it's just for that call. we oftentimes establish a hot zone. We start establishing an inner perimeter and outer perimeter once we go on scene. And at that point, we'll establish a staging area for additional resources and also a command post.
When you say we, is that your responsibility?
Technically it is, but fluid situations like this, if I'm forgetting something and somebody tells me, hey, this needs to happen, for me, thank you.
Now, there came a point in time when you began to request additional resources. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Now, when you do you recall requesting less lethal tools?
Correct.
Why did you request additional less lethal tools?
Also, I mean, we talk about an array of force and having every tool out there if needed. Also, depending on what tool we're talking about, it can give us distance, creates distance for ourselves and who we're dealing with.
What less lethal tool did you bring up with you when you first arrived?
I had taken beanbag.
Now, why did you choose to give your beanbag shotgun to another officer, I believe Officer Wetterland?
Yes, I was the only supervisor, and it's usually, for me to run the scene and to be behind a tool just wasn't a good idea for me, so I passed it off to Officer Wetterland.
That brings up a good point. Now, as a supervisor, how removed should you be from the individuals who are making contact with Mr. Boyd and the individuals who are providing cover, either with a less lethal tool or with deadly force?
It can be different for each call. Sometimes you're a pretty good ways back or kind of, not necessarily actively involved, but kind of overseeing the whole situation and hopefully, picking up, parts of the call where, as a supervisor, it's my responsibility to, make certain decisions for the officers that are on scene and also, dealing with whoever we're dealing with.
What advantage, as a supervisor, does distance from your officers who are engaging with the suspect give you in terms of making objective decisions?
It gives the advantage of being able to hopefully see the overall picture.
Now, with the overall picture in mind, what was your role in terms of supervising the CIT officers who arrived on that scene?
So, in my squad, I had no CIT officers that were trained at that point. I was previously trained as a CIT, but when I went to narcotics for 3 years, I guess I wasn't technically certified when I came back out as a field service supervisor. So I did ask, on scene, who's CIT certified, and Officer Monet had said that he was. So being the supervisor, it was kind of given that he would pick up communication with Mr. Boyd at that point.
Now, to be clear, what type of training did you receive in order to become a CIT officer?
It's an additional 40 hours of training. In the academy, you do scenario-based training. You also receive some classroom instruction, PowerPoint instruction, and it's some additional 40 hours of the same training, a little bit more in depth.
Now, how long did you actually work or serve as a CIT officer?
I want to say, again, it's been some time, approximately 4 years, I believe, is one of the first certifications I received as a patrolman.
Now, I also understand that before you became a police officer, you worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital.
Yes, sir.
And what type of work did you have working with the mentally ill and individuals who were suffering from mental illness?
Oftentimes, there were nurses that worked there also at the Veterans Psychiatric Ward. So for me, oftentimes it was to defuse the situation, attempt to defuse the situation. So that way, we had a lot of female nurses. That way, they can either administer medication, and they would also assist too.
So it would be fair to say that there was a time in your life before you became a police officer that you worked in the Veterans Administration Veterans Administration Hospital Psychiatric Unit. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And how long did you do that?
Approximately a year and a half.
Now, turning your attention back to the incident at hand, there came a particular point in time in which you began to request additional less lethal tools. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you had brought up a beanbag shotgun. Is that
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes,
and it
sir.
was given to Officer Wetterlin.
Correct.
Now, why did you begin to ask for additional less lethal firearms when you already had a beanbag shotgun on scene?
Again, to provide distance. Also, the tasers that officers carry on their belt only give us so much distance. And I know the taser shotgun is another tool that can be used to incapacitate somebody. So hopefully, at some point, possibly we can move up and either detain or go hands-on with somebody.
When you asked for the taser shotgun, how did you go about doing that?
First, I asked our dispatch radio. I asked if there was any officer throughout the city, citywide, with a taser shotgun.
Okay. Now, when you asked for any officer citywide, at any point did you request for a specific officer or a specific unit?
I did at later on when I checked back. There was no officer that had the taser shotgun in the city that was working field services. So I did request. I previously working in SID. I had asked gangs, knowing that they have an on-call.
Now, you had said SID. Would you please explain to the jury that I guess that particular branch of APD and what SID is and how gangs is related to it, and what other units are in SID?
SID stands for Special Investigation Division. So you have narcotics, vice, gangs. You have the Repeat Offender Project. You also have a couple other units that are in SID. And just simply stated, narcotics works narcotic cases, gangs, they'll work, gang cases, and so forth.
Now, what is it about Special Investigations Division, I believe, that had you asked for their taser shotgun as opposed to any other unit that was available?
So the way I understand, when I asked being SID, I wanted the tool. So if somebody had that tool, come out and assist is basically, I believe, what you're asking me, asking SID, although I asked for gangs, because another unit showed up with that tool, I'm not going to tell them to turn around and walk away.
Now, I understand there came a point in time after requesting the various tools that you did, and I guess I should also back up and ask you about another tool that was requested. Would you please explain to the jury why you requested that a officer who has a police service dog to respond to the scene?
Well, at the time, initially when I had heard the call come out, and I believe it was also on the CADs, you have officers with guns, and then with their guns out, and then you have Mr. Boyd with deadly weapons. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Why did you ask for a police service dog handler to
Correct.
show up with their police service dog?
Correct. So at that point, I knew at some point we're going to have to develop a perimeter. But there was based on the terrain, for me to have a police service dog out there that could cover ground that some officers couldn't cover. There was I want to say it was probably the northeast side were there. As I remember it, there was a large rock, and it was hard to get a complete perimeter out there. And there was still people walking around using that path to run. And on that east side, I remember seeing, and I believe it was 8 or 9 civilians. So at that point, it wasn't just Mr. Boyd and the officers. There was also people out there that I had to be concerned about.
Why is it that you were concerned about the other people who were using the open space to essentially recreate on this Sunday afternoon?
Well, the reason it was concerning to me was because Mr. Boyd not only had deadly weapons, but I was thinking that based on the way he was acting, he was not safe for the community. And the reason I say that is because him being up and down, and then some of the threats he was making, if we just packed up and walked away, we wouldn't be doing our job in protecting the community. So I was also thinking, at very least, he may need a mental health evaluation.
Now, you would agree with me that part of your responsibility as an Albuquerque Police Department officer, Albuquerque Police Department sergeant, is to use your video recording device to record the incident that was happening during this call. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And did you do so?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, you previously have ruled through the testimony of Jess Stone that Officer Perez had met the burden to show that Officer Carpenter's video camera, Exhibit B2A, B2B, and B2C, met the business records exception to the rule of hearsay. Also, Detective Stone also testified to the authenticity and accuracy as to the transcripts that were made of Sergeant Carpenter's video, and that's Exhibit D, 4, B, and C. And at this time, Your Honor, I'd like to use that video and that transcript with this witness.
Your Honor, I object. Not only is it hearsay, but it is also cumulative. The information recorded on Sergeant Carpenter's taser cam is identical to the information contained on Officer McDaniel's taser cam. And I think we're going to have a repeat of the same kinds of video footage and transcript as we had with Officer McDaniel. They were right there together the whole time. Cumulative.
So if the objection is cumulative, I have made certain that the portions of Sergeant Carpenter's video that I would play have not been played thus far.
Exhibit B2A, B2C, sorry, B2A, B2B, and B2C, as well as B4B and B4C.
At this time, I would like to play from Exhibit B2A, the Sergeant Carpenter's video from the time of 3 minutes and 5 seconds to 4 minutes and 15 seconds, and that portion of the transcript would also play along with it. That's page 3, line 15 through page 4, line 17.
I don't know if you can run that. He's showing that BA Boss is the first man. No.
Now, based on your observations of Mr. Boyd, what was Mr. Boyd doing and saying that led you to conclude that he may be mentally ill?
He wasn't, in the way I observed it, is he wasn't being rational. And what I mean by that is, when we were telling him basically to put down the knives, wasn't listening at all. He was, again, you would see him, he would get very excited and start yelling. And then there was times where he would calm down. But even when he was calm, he still wasn't listening to what officers, the information and the commands that officers were giving him.
Now, you would agree with me that you've come across criminal suspects who are not mentally ill and they refuse police commands. Is that fair?
Correct.
Now, what is it about Mr. Boyd not following police commands that led you to believe that he was mentally ill as opposed to someone who just didn't want to listen to what you had to say?
Can you say that one more time, sir? I'm sorry.
Now, you would agree with me that you've dealt with criminal suspects who refuse to do what's asked of them by the police.
Correct.
And what is it about what Mr. Boyd was doing that led you to believe that he was mentally ill as opposed to just being a criminal suspect who just simply didn't want to do what you all wanted him to do?
I think the difference was just his language, and you can hear some of that there. Some of the stuff he was saying was kind of out of touch with reality. And we're all going to be dead in 5 months. And also, he was, there was times he was telling us basically he was in the driver's seat. He was in charge. So it was his scene, which to me, the facts is, this is not the case. We want a peaceful resolution, but at some point, you need to listen to what we're saying, and that wasn't there.
Now, I'd like to move forward in the incident and move to that point where it's approximately 5:23 in the afternoon, and using Exhibit A, now, you're familiar, of course, with the computer-aided dispatch report, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, who made the radio dispatch that is the basis of this summary of what was said?
That would be myself.
Okay. Now, what did you say over the radio about who Mr. Boyd was and what he was doing?
Do you want me to read this, sir?
Well, tell us what you said over the radio.
Basically that I said quite a few things. I was trying to update dispatch as to what was going on scene, so that when responding officers, and also so dispatch can document it. So that way when responding officers, they can pull up the CAD and see what's going on, and also if they're listening, they can hear what's going on. So when he would pull out knives and when he wasn't listening and when he wasn't following commands, there were certain times throughout that call which I would update our dispatch and let them know exactly what was going on.
Now, approximately what time did this particular incident happen in which Mr. Boyd was not being reasonable and that he was told that if he passed a certain point, he would be beanbagged?
5:23 p.m.
Now, you were there when this incident occurred, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you please explain to the jury what Mr. Boyd did that brought about a warning to him that he would be beanbagged if he passed a certain point?
He was moving towards officers, and at the time there was enough officers on scene to create kind of a makeshift L formation is in a sense what we had. We didn't have enough officers to back off to a point where which would give us, which would create more distance. So with the numbers we were working with, I felt that at certain points he was getting too close to a number of the officers on scene.
Now, please explain that what was happening at that point when you warned Mr. Boyd that if he passed a certain point, he would be beanbagged? What was Mr. Boyd doing?
He actually was taking steps directly towards, the way I remember it, there was Officer Wetterland, which had a beanbag. And there were officers that were covering him with a lethal option. But I felt that Mr. Boyd was a direct threat to Officer Wetterland. And I remember that being on my right side, just at times talking on the radio and trying to use peripheral vision and take a step back. So when he would cross a certain rock that we had pointed out, I felt that it was definitely needed to tell him, hey, if you cross that certain rock, we will use less lethal in beanbag you.
Now, as a supervisor, where were you positioning yourself away from the officers who were actually contacting Mr. Boyd, Officer Monette, and Officer Wetterland, and the other officers who had weapons drawn?
So those officers were on the south of him, and the direction was the south also. So I was behind them. You know, there was times where I would step up and move back, but I was operating in that area, moving south, back and forth.
Now, being away from that front line of officers who were dealing with Mr. Boyd, what advantage did that give you to be able to have a perspective of what was happening?
I think, like I stated before, being able to step back and kind of take a look at the overall picture, because I believe it's human nature. Sometimes you just get tunneled in. You can be dealing with a certain situation and you get that tunnel vision. So sometimes to break that, it's good to take a step back to see the overall picture.
Now, with the court's permission, I would like Sergeant Carpenter to stand and to demonstrate to the jury what Mr. Boyd was doing specifically as he began to close distance and focus on Officer Wetterland.
I'm going to object to the question as being a leading description, adding the close distance, which is not a word that he's used. But I have no objection in standing and demonstrating as long as we strike Mr. Globus's comments, which is testimony.
You may stand down to demonstrate, and when you ask the witness to make demonstrations, please do not.
Okay. So at the time, officers were.
One second, I'm not sure if Mr. Robles wanted you to stand or come down to the floor.
Because the demonstration might be short, I didn't want to take up too much time doing that. And unless, of course, you all can't see, I was hoping to move things along by not having that happen.
Never see the witness.
So basically, he went towards that point, and he was like this, and then he would take a step back, and then he had done it a second time, and then took a step back.
For the record, the witness is moving, taking a step forward on his left foot, moving back his weight to his right foot, and then again to his left foot and back.
And how was Mr. Boyd holding his hands?
As to the best of my recollection, I remember him having both knives out and in both hands, and moving towards, like I stated, Officer Chris Wetterland.
Thank you very much. You can take your seat. Now, did there come a point in time when you had an opportunity to speak with the open space officers who were there?
I vaguely remember speaking to Open Space Officer Hernandez when I arrived.
What did Open Space Officer Hernandez tell you about his encounter with Mr. Boyd?
Objection, hearsay, Your Honor.
When I arrived, I do remember going up to him and asking him basically what did we have, and I think I asked him, what laws were broken, something to that effect, and he said illegal camping, and that Mr. Boyd had pulled his knives out, which caused him and the other officer to step back.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about the attempts that were made to negotiate with Mr. Boyd. Now, were those attempts to negotiate with Mr. Boyd recorded on your taser camera video?
You're talking about me?
Yes.
Negotiating? Yes.
Now, with the court's permission, I would like to play a portion of Exhibit B2A from the time 11:09 to 13:30, and then the transcript, which is Exhibit D4A, and that would be page 14, line 8 through page 17, line 15.
Right now, I can guarantee you your safety as long as you just put the knives down and stop. I'm just saying, no, I'm not. Put them in your pocket then. Put them in your pocket. We're gonna have to call and talk to you. We'll take them, but we can't talk to you with knives like this. Are they serving now? Could you close them? Yeah. Are they flip open knives? What I'm saying is, if they're flip open ones and you shut them, we'll start there. How about that? I'm saying not have a blade exposed. I was just talking to the blade. So what you're supposed to do, that's what I was doing to you. I'm not funny, but look at me. You're not going to put it in the video. I think keep the sensor. I'm just trying to get some basics here. You got water, you drink, you got food water, I gotta hold down and need one more. Okay, so you gonna get water wine? Go on, get on water. I'm good, I'm good, I'm back. You've been up here for a while, we're pretty good. No? But, okay, stop at that. You hungry? You eating? You been eating? You been eating? Oh, I've been eating, okay. What's the drink? Like, when was the last time you ate it? Yeah, last time. Okay, but what time though? Like what time? Okay. That was too long ago, right? So you don't need anything, you're not hungry, or you something to eat, think on, or what? But, what are we gonna make? What are you making?
Now, who was the individual who was speaking with Mr. Boyd?
Officer Monet.
Now, as a former CIT officer, what techniques was Officer Monet using to try and create rapport or create a conversation with Mr. Boyd?
Well, I think he was at times trying to de-escalate Officer or Mr. Boyd, and trying to. At one point, they were talking about the knives, so he kind of diverted and started talking about his well-being to make him seem like, hey, we care about if you've had anything to drink, if you've had any food, if you've had some rest. If not, possibly we can, provide that to you, throw you up some water, stuff like that. Just trying to redirect him.
How successful were Officer Monet's efforts to redirect Mr. Boyd's attention and try to ultimately diffuse the situation so that Mr. Boyd would give up his knives?
I think he did an okay job. He did pretty good. The only thing that I think about is, yes, you're dealing with somebody who we think at the moment may have some type of mental illness going on. But like I said before, officer safety being number one, you can divert or change the subject with Mr. Boyd, but he still has the knives. At some point, he needs to put those down or put them away. So, I think he did good in getting them calmed down. But I do know that when you would bring up the knives, he would escalate again. Mr. Boyd would.
Now, so officer safety is the first goal of negotiating with someone like this. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And how successful was Officer Monet in achieving officer safety through the course of his negotiations with Mr. Boyd?
I think, you know, at the time, there was conversation, there was dialogue going on. So I think, you know, at that moment, which was just played, I think he was pretty successful.
Now, how successful was Officer Monet in convincing Mr. Boyd to simply put away the knives or give them up altogether?
None of us were.
Now, there came a different point in time, I believe it's 524, turning to Exhibit A. Do you see that portion of Exhibit A?
I do.
Now, who is the person who is making the request that's stated there?
Myself.
At approximately what time were you making that the request?
5:24 p.m.
Now, what specific requests were you making over the APD radio?
I had requested state police, and previously I had talked to radio about a response time for crisis negotiation team.
Well, let's take the first thing, crisis negotiations team. Why did you request the presence of a crisis negotiations team when you had an officer, Officer Monet, who was CIT trained, and you as a supervisor who had previously been a CIT officer?
You go back to, well, I mean, if the more tools we have out there that we have at our disposal, I was thinking, let's try a little bit of everything to possibly resolve this.
Now, turning your attention to the statement about the state police, I believe it says check with state police about POS with CIT training. What is that?
The POS would be possible with CIT training. So I was, Mr. Boyd had said that he was requesting a liaison, state police liaison. Which in my past, you know, experience and training, I can probably count on one hand, if any, when I requested state police. So I felt, well, not something that I've normally done, but let's try to meet Mr. Boyd halfway. Maybe if we get a state police officer out there and is able to talk to him and de-escalate the situation, let's go with it.
So you requested the state police to respond to the incident because Mr. Boyd asked you to do that?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention once again to Exhibit A at about 5:59. Now, who made the statement that's the basis of this CAD entry?
I did.
At approximately what time was that statement made?
5:59 p.m.
And first, before you made that statement, would you please explain what happened when the state police officer arrived and began to negotiate with Mr. Boyd?
Once he arrived,
I should back up. You said he. Who is he? Do you know his name?
I can't recall at the moment.
Okay. But it was a state police officer?
Correct. I know at a certain point there was two, and the first one that had responded, forgive me, but I can't recall his name, but and I do know at some point Sergeant Chris Ware was there. I believe it was State Police Officer Berngston or something to that nature.
Now, were you there when that particular state police officer who negotiated with Mr. Boyd conducted negotiations with Mr. Boyd?
I was, like I said, on the south side, moving back and forth.
Please describe what you remember about the negotiations that the state police officer had with Mr. Boyd.
It was much of the same. Officer safety, you know, put the knives down, and there was no progress.
So it's fair to say that the presence of a state police officer was not sufficient to diffuse the situation with Mr. Boyd.
No, sir.
And that's why you stated that over the air.
Yes, sir.
Now, what is the importance of stating over the air the outcome of the negotiations with state police?
Again, it was letting everyone know and other officers that could possibly respond. Kind of a small picture of what we're dealing with out there. We've tried a number of things, and at this point has been no progress that has been made.
Now, there came a point in time at 6 o'clock, also focusing on Exhibit A. Who made the comment that's the basis for this CAD statement, this statement in the CADs?
I did.
And at approximately what time was that statement made?
6 p.m.
So what did you say over the radio about Mr. Boyd and what he did?
That Mr. Boyd was asked to put his weapons down and to walk to officers. And his exact statements were, he won't submit to anybody.
And that's what you heard Mr. Boyd say to the officers?
Yes, sir.
Why did you decide to make that known over the radio?
Well, I mean, I think it's, every officer and, supervisor, you want to resolve it. You do. So you're trying. And then when for me at the time, there's no resolve. It's like, you can't predict the future. You're not sure what's going to happen. So him saying that he won't submit to anybody, I'm letting people know basically, what the type of individual we're dealing with. He's, again, being unreasonable, not being rational.
Now, turning your attention again to Exhibit A at 6:04. Who made the statement who made the statement in the CAD?
I did.
Now, approximately what time was this statement made?
6:04 p.m.
Now, what specifically did you request?
I was asking pretty much our information unit over the radio to run James M. Boyd with the date of birth of 4/8 of 1975.
Who was able to obtain the information that the person you were dealing with is James M. Boyd and that person's date of birth?
I can't recall exactly who was able to obtain that information.
Now, you would agree with me that at 6:13, also focusing on Exhibit A, you received information from the information unit about what was taking place?
Objection, Levy.
I'm going to sustain that objection.
Would you please explain what you learned from the information unit at the Albuquerque Police Department after you requested information about James Boyd?
I was informed that basically he had somewhat of a violent past. There was some battery charges. There was also dealing with officers. There was a battery on police officers that he had previously been charged, and there were reports of that.
Now, I'm going to turn your attention to Exhibit A at 6:23 p.m. Is what you see in front of you the information you heard over the radio about Mr. Boyd?
It is.
Now, what do you recall hearing over the radio about Mr. Boyd and the history that was given to you by the information unit? And let's just start with the first line. James Boyd listed in CIT, no case.
Correct.
I'm going to object at this being cumulative. I think we've been through this now with 2 or 3 different witnesses.
Subject James Boyd listed in there's CIT detectives which is a unit in the police department where they track people with kind of a extensive mental illness.
And what did you learn about James Boyd and whether he was being tracked as an individual and as an individual?
That he was not.
Now, based on your experience and training, what did it mean to you that Mr. Boyd had an extensive criminal history of aggravated battery on peace officers in various jurisdictions, including Albuquerque?
That we were dealing with a violent individual.
Please explain if you believe whether his interaction with all of you during the time that you were there was consistent with his prior history of aggravated battery on peace officers in various jurisdictions, including Albuquerque.
I believe it was consistent.
Now, there's also a statement about Mr. Boyd being a paranoid schizophrenic.
Correct.
Now, based on your CIT training, what type of work do you need to do with someone who's a paranoid schizophrenic to try to bring them to a place where they're no longer in crisis?
Well, dealing with somebody with schizophrenia or mental illness, there's several things that I guess you can do. You know, the level of tone that you're talking to them, keeping your voice down. Also, I just recall dealing with people with this type of mental illness before. Oftentimes don't want to be touched. Trying to redirect them at times, but him being paranoid and not necessarily wanting to deal with police, it was a difficult situation to be in.
So when you heard over the radio to use extreme caution when contacting Mr. Boyd, what did that tell you about how you had to proceed with your future interactions with him?
Well, proceed with definitely, proceed with caution.
Now, at this particular point, how successful was Officer Monet in trying to resolve the situation and convince Mr. Boyd to relinquish his knives?
So Officer Monet was the CIT officer dealing with him. And at this point, I think we went over, we tried state police, and I had even talked to him, and I had told him, hey, I'm done talking to you. At a certain point, I don't think he really wanted to continue dialogue with me. I don't think any of us were successful at getting him to even, do anything with his knives. Put him down, put him in his pocket, close the folding knives, the blades. So I don't.
Now, there came a point in time when you came off of the hill and you ended your interactions with Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, turning to Exhibit A at 617. Now, would you agree that at 617 a radio dispatch was made to ask you to begin to withdraw?
I agree.
Do you remember who made that radio dispatch asking all of you to withdraw?
As I remember, it was Officer McFarland.
Okay. Now, Officer McFarland is an officer, and you're a sergeant, correct?
Correct.
As a sergeant, what authority did you have to tell an officer to essentially that you won't do what he's asking?
Yeah, I have that authority. At the end of the day, we all make our own choices, but I have the authority to tell him that.
Why did you Why did you choose to withdraw from the hill where Mr. Boyd was located instead of telling Officer McFarland, "No, we're staying"?
Well, me never being trained or in the tactical, whether it's K-9 bombs or as a SWAT officer, I haven't been in tactical. So, as a supervisor, if you will, a team concept, that officer is also a tool, and him being trained as a tactical officer, knowing that, hey, let's create some distance, to me was a good choice. That's why there was no reason to tell him, no, we're not going to do that. Also, where we were at, I do think we were dealing with somebody who's a bit unpredictable. We were, you can argue we were too close. So when he had called us to move back, I thought it was a good decision.
As you began to move back, what role did you and the members of the Foothills Area Command squads play in creating a perimeter?
I know there was conversation about, let's start a, if you will, an outer perimeter. I guess, what I thought was the outer perimeter, you can put an officer with less lethal and, another officer with as a lethal option. And let's kind of get him circled off here.
Now, based on your observations at that time, how many, citizens of Albuquerque were in the open space?
There were several. I know, again, I remember seeing 8 or 9, possibly 10, that were northeast of where we were, of the situation. And there was also, I remember at times people still on the run path, so we had to stick an officer on one end of the run path on the north side and one on the south side, so they're not moving within the scene.
Now, another question, and that is, you had a choice as a supervisor to request a SWAT activation, is that right?
Correct.
Would you please explain why you chose, at this particular point, not to make this a SWAT activation?
Well, when I talked to Officer Hernandez, he had said that, Mr. Boyd had pulled out knives and caused him to step back. So I remember thinking to myself, well, that's, assault. And I, to the best, as I remember it, I went over the air twice asking, hey, do we have felony charges? What charges do we have? Expecting one of the open space officers to key up and say, hey, this is what we have. And I didn't get that either time. So as a supervisor, I started questioning, well, do we have felony charges? That was in my mind, even though, as I believe, possibly we did. I remember, being a detective, like in court, these officers didn't say it on the radio, but then I was thinking maybe the radio transmissions, they were broken up there, so let me say it again. So I don't know if they heard, but there wasn't the response I was hoping for, and so that way we can document it. So I felt it didn't meet the criteria at the moment in our SOP for a SWAT activation.
May I have a moment to confer, Your Honor? Turning your attention to the end of the incident, you were there when force was used against Mr. Boyd, is that right?
No.
You weren't there? I guess I should say, and where were you when deadly force was used against Mr. Boyd?
In the backyard of the calling party.
So is it fair to say that you were not in a position to actually see the use of force against Mr. Boyd?
No, sir.
You were simply able to hear sounds, is that right?
I did hear it.
And you were in the backyard of the calling party. Mr. Thixton, does that sound about right to you?
Correct.
Those are the questions I have. Pass the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Morning, sir.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Sir, you had asked for a taser shotgun. You weren't concerned with who particularly brought it as long as you got a taser shotgun down there. Is that correct?
Objection, leading, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, I'll rephrase. Did you care who the individual was that came with a taser shotgun?
No, sir. I was just requesting the tool and somebody who's trained to use that tool.
And you were and you understood SID stands for
Special Investigation Division.
and you understand, I think you said, am I correct that, well, is the repeat offender project is something you mentioned earlier?
Correct.
Is that under SID?
Correct.
Do you have an understanding of whether or not Keith Sandy is in that unit?
I do.
Did in fact dispatch inform you, did dispatch inform you that Keith Sandy was en route with a taser shotgun?
Objection leaving, Your Honor.
Did dispatch inform you if anyone was en route with a taser shotgun?
Objection leaving, Your Honor.
I'm sorry. What did dispatch inform you as far as whether or not anyone was responding with a taser shotgun?
They did advise that someone was responding.
Okay. And by the way, what was your intent when you asked for a taser shotgun? That that's just a shot? Was it that a shotgun would just be dropped off, or that an officer would come with the shotgun and the officer would stay on scene?
Objection leaving, Your Honor.
So, for the taser shotgun, you have to be trained to use that tool. To the best of my ability, I don't believe the field officers that were out there were trained to use that. So, knowing that SID has that tool and has been trained to use it is the reason I thought SID.
Just to be clear, what officer suggested to you that your field officers tactically withdraw away from Mr. Boyd?
SWAT officer McFarland.
Did Keith Sandy ever instruct you to do anything with your officers?
Objection leaving, Your Honor.
Did you ever have any conversations with Keith Sandy?
I don't recall specifically. I don't.
I just have a moment, John.
Don't have any other questions. Thank you, sir. Thank you, John.
Good afternoon, or morning still, I guess. It feels like afternoon for all of us who've been here for a while. Sergeant Carpenter, okay. The last question that was asked was whether you had any conversations with Keith Sandy. And if I can have the Elmo put back on, Judge. Can you see State's Exhibit 32E2? Is that you, Sergeant Carpenter, right there?
Correct.
And can you see right here, right in front here, who is, can you tell if that's Defendant Keith Sandy right there, right in front, face to face with you?
Well, I mean, I can't tell according to the picture, but I have knowledge of, yes.
Okay,
being
that's
there.
who it is right there, isn't it, sir?
Correct.
And that's when you were first called down to talk to folks?
Correct.
And this person here is SWAT Officer McFarland?
Correct.
Ingram?
Yes, ma'am.
And I guess, this person here is Scott Weimerskirch, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And did those four people arrive together approximately at the bottom of the hill?
I would say, yeah, approximately.
All right. Let me go back and start with where Mr. Robles started with you. You worked for a year and a half as a nurse tech on the VA psychiatric ward, did you not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And in that job, you got to talk to some of the veterans who were suffering from mental illness
Yes, ma'am.
and learn their stories.
Yes, ma'am.
And as a result of that, you came to the conclusion that people with mental illness are people just like the rest of us, didn't you, sir?
Correct.
Your goal when you arrived out at the scene was to make sure that everybody out there was okay. Is that right?
Correct.
You wanted to make sure you didn't want anything to happen to Mr. Boyd, did you?
No, I think what you're saying is a peaceful resolution. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. And that meant you didn't want anything to happen to Mr. Boyd, did you, sir?
You know, at the time, I don't know who, as an officer, goes out and wants something to happen to somebody else. I mean, we do this to serve the community.
Yes, sir. And in fact, you're one of those people who likes to believe that there are not police officers who show up to work thinking, I want to shoot somebody today. Is that right?
Relevance, Your Honor.
Judge, I'm following up on his answer to my question. Okay. Let me go back to where we were. You didn't want anything to happen to Mr. Boyd, did you, sir?
Objection asked and answered.
Okay. You didn't want anything to happen to your officers.
Absolutely not.
And in order to keep that from happening, you tried to keep your officers at least 25 to 30 feet away from Mr. Boyd, didn't you, sir?
25 to 30 feet.
Yes, sir.
I think when we backed up, ma'am, we were probably a little bit further than that.
Okay, when you first got there, though, the closest you ever got was within 25 to 30 feet of Mr. Boyd. Is that right, sir?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, sounds about right.
All right. When you first arrived, you were not afraid of Mr. Boyd, were you, sir?
When I first arrived,
Yes, sir.
personally,
Yes, sir.
personally, there was fear. Now, for myself, no, but for the officers on scene, yes, which
All right.
I've stated.
You've given a deposition under oath in this before, haven't you, sir?
Yes.
All right. And in that deposition, you were asked that exact same question. Page 84, line 5, counsel. Were you scared of Mr. Boyd when you arrived on scene? And your answer, sir, initially when I first arrived on scene, no. I think I was. My feelings were for the other officers. But question, you weren't personally in fear that he was going to harm you in that moment? And your answer, sir, right when I arrived on scene, I don't remember having that feeling. I don't. Is that correct, sir?
I would object in proper impeachment. That's not an inconsistent statement with what he testified to.
Mr. Boyd was up and down
Yes,
and was irate sometimes,
he was.
and at other times he was calm in answering your questions, wasn't he, sir?
At times, yes, he was.
All right. And you knew right away that he was mentally ill, didn't you, sir?
I had suspected it, but as far as knowing for sure, no. I mean, in narcotics, you've dealt with people who may have been on some type of illegal narcotic, which causes them to act a certain way.
Within minutes of arriving at the scene, didn't you put out over the radio that he's probably, definitely 1040?
Possibly, yes.
All right. Would you like me to show you the transcript of your radio dispatch, sir?
Yes.
Okay.
I could be wrong, ma'am, but I think I did say possibly.
Yes, sir. Probably, definitely 1040 is what you said put out over the radio. Is that right?
If you can show that to me, yes.
Oh,
ma'am.
yes, sir. I can.
Let me see what he's showing. What's he showing?
This is the transcript of his taser cam, page 4, line 8 to 9.
Do you know what time this is, ma'am?
Yes, sir. This is right after you arrived.
This is one of the clips they got.
Yes, Your Honor, it is. Right after you arrived.
The only reason I asked for time, if you can rephrase your question, because I think you said as soon as I got there, I knew that he was.
Okay. Within a few minutes after arriving, Sergeant Carpenter,
Yes.
you knew that he was mentally ill. Is that right?
Correct.
And you put out over the radio that he is probably definitely 1040, and that means mentally ill. Is that right?
Correct.
And one of the reasons you had a question about whether you even had criminal charges is because you knew when someone is mentally ill, they may not be legally able to form intent for criminal charges. Isn't that right, sir?
Judge, the extended calls for a legal conclusion.
As an officer, you had the choice of either taking Mr. Boyd to jail or taking him for a mental evaluation, didn't you, sir?
Based on the training, there is mental health. Like for somebody who has mental health, I think based on my training, I've heard it said that the jail has the best like facility and people to deal with certain situations like that.
Yes, sir. But you, because Mr. Boyd was shot, you never did figure out whether you were going to take him to UNMH or take him to the jail, did you, sir?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that? Or
Yeah,
can you...
yes, sir. Because if Mr. Boyd had not been shot, you don't know whether you would have taken him to jail or taken him to the hospital, do you, sir? You questioned once you arrived whether they even had felony charges on him. Isn't that right, sir?
As I remember it, ma'am, is I thought there was, and then, like I said, when I did begin to question it when I had asked a couple of times on the radio, and there wasn't a response.
Okay, and one of the things you asked, again, almost immediately after you arrived, on the radio, what laws is he breaking right now? Isn't that what you asked?
I did. I talked to Officer Hernandez.
And Officer Hernandez said he can't be in the open space, is what he answered at first. Is that right?
It was something to that effect.
Okay. And then Officer Hernandez added, and he pulled the knives out. We told him to put the knives away, put the knives down. He can't approach us with knives. He's got to go. Isn't that what Officer Hernandez told you?
I don't recall it that way, ma'am.
Would you like me to show you the transcript again of your taser cam?
I know there's video which I have previously seen, and the way I remember it is when I had talked to him, I believe I'm the one that said that he's got to go.
All right. Well, so this is your taser transcript of your taser footage, sir.
I'm not talking about the transcript, ma'am. I'm talking about the video. I believe I was the one that said he had to go.
All right, sir. But the thing you were talking about on direct was that you needed a criminal felony to activate the SWAT team or a big response of officers. Isn't that right?
I don't, per SOP, yes, but I do know based on past experience that they could respond, if it meets certain criteria. But I felt when I was to the point where I've done, X, Y, and Z, I would feel comfortable calling SWAT, knowing that I've tried to resolve it on my own.
Yes, sir. And my question, I think, is a little bit simpler. You said, I kept trying to get them to say it on the air, and that's because you need a record of some kind of criminal felony to be able to activate particular kinds of responses in APD. Is that right?
Well, in the past, I have had tactical canine officers come out to misdemeanors, and I have.
Yes, sir. You wanted Officer Hernandez to articulate over the air that there was an aggravated assault, and he did not do so. Is that right, sir?
I'm sorry, correct.
And you tried to get him to say it over the air so you could get more resources, and he did not do so. Is that right?
Correct.
Let's talk about chain of command. When you arrived at the scene, you were in charge as the supervisor, were you not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And the purpose to have the sergeant be in charge at a priority call is so that sergeant can place and direct the officers underneath him. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, you want one person in charge at a scene, particularly one where there are a lot of moving parts, do you not?
Ultimately, yes, ma'am.
And the sergeant's job is to make sure that he has the right resources to handle the situation?
Can be, yes, ma'am.
And he can call for more resources if he needs them?
Yes, I have been on scenes as a supervisor when, officers, have called for, like, other resources. And as a supervisor, you're thinking, they're providing assistance.
Okay, and it was your job and your responsibility to make sure that this scene was run correctly, was it not?
It was, and
Okay, I'm sorry.
later
Go ahead.
on, there was another supervisor that had arrived.
That's exactly what I want to get to. You're
Oh,
going
okay.
right where I want to go. You were in charge until the SWAT sergeant arrived, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And when SWAT arrives, the rule is that the SWAT sergeant is in charge. Is that right?
Correct.
And everybody knows that in APD, don't they?
I believe so, ma'am.
And that's not the case when other units arrive. For example, the K-9 unit, when they arrive at a scene where you're in charge, you're still in charge, isn't that right?
If I may explain.
Sure.
Yes, but so you have a supervisor out there with a number of individuals, and you're trying to take everything into consideration. So yes, ultimately, yes, I was in charge. But if somebody's giving you correct advice as a supervisor, I think I would be foolish not to listen to some of that correct advice.
Yes, sir, and that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking just,
Okay.
you were the one in charge.
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
And that's true, when Rope arrives, Rope doesn't take over. You're still in charge, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And at some point early in this encounter, SWAT Sergeant Jim Fox spoke to you on the radio after your field officers were assembled and asked if you needed any help. Do you recall that, sir?
No, ma'am, I don't believe it was over the radio.
Okay, was it over the telephone, sir, maybe?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, he called you on the phone and asked if you needed help, and you told him you had things well in hand, didn't you, sir?
No, ma'am, I didn't tell him that exact statement.
Okay, but you told him he didn't need to come.
No, he told me he was coming.
Okay, and if he testified that you told him that he didn't need to come, do you disagree with his testimony?
Asking this witness to comment on other testimony and her saying what other testimony was.
Yeah, I think the jury has heard that.
Okay.
If he says he called and said, do I need to come, and you told him you had things in hand and he didn't need to come, do you disagree with Sergeant Fox?
So the way I remember that phone call is this way. He had called, and I told him that, basically, right now, I think things are okay.
Okay.
He did tell me that he would send me a couple of officers and high ground, and that he would, be en route.
Okay.
So I said okay, and then that ended the conversation.
Right, you also talked to your lieutenant, and he asked if you were going to make it a SWAT call, did he not, sir?
Correct.
And you said no, you thought you could resolve the situation.
Correct. At that moment, I said, no, not at the moment.
And you said to him, I'm not going to let anything happen, didn't you, sir?
I don't remember that, ma'am, but possibly.
Okay, I'll be glad to show you your deposition, sir. Page 90. Asked you about your lieutenant right there, you to there. You said, I'm not going to let anything happen.
Okay.
Did I read that correctly, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Let's talk about your plan before SWAT arrived, okay?
Okay.
Your plan was to try to talk the knives off of Mr. Boyd. Isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
You wanted to try to resolve this situation without any use of force, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was your plan both before and after the time that you were up there yourself with Mr. Boyd, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
You felt there were times when people were making headway with Mr. Boyd, didn't you?
I do, to an extent. We still, again, officer safety, separating him from those knives was
All right.
our number one goal.
One of the people who was making progress with Mr. Boyd was the person we heard on one of these tapes, that's Mike Monette, is that right?
Somewhat, yes.
And you felt that at some point, just continuing to talk to him, he would possibly put the knives away, didn't you, sir?
So when you say I felt, so that was the goal, to try to get him to resolve it peacefully. But I don't think, after all of us talking to him, we were making much headway in officer safety as far as removing him from the knives,
Do you
or the
remember-
knives from him.
I'm sorry, sir, do you remember when you gave your deposition under oath on May 29th of 2015?
That's why I said felt. I had a feeling you were going to say I had answered a certain question.
Yes, sir. So, here's the question, sir, page 113. And so when the outer perimeter formed, your plan was still to talk to him. He said, yes, and I felt that there were times like I felt certain people were making headway, and then he was kind of up and down. But you know, I felt at some point, just continuing to talk to him, he would possibly put the knives away. Isn't that what you said in your deposition, sir?
Correct. And if I may explain, that statement's still true, but when you're out there, and you know, you do have time, so time can be on your side. And normally, you know, training and experience, past experience, you are able to at least separate him from the knives. So that doesn't mean we still don't possibly may not use force. It may be some type of other force to take him into custody. So I do feel correct that the statement is true, but I also feel that it was an up and down situation, and I think which is true to that statement too. It was up and down, and you know, I just felt as a supervisor, I want to resolve this, and that was not happening.
Okay, and so your statement that I felt at some point just continuing to talk to him, he would possibly put the knives away, that's a true statement, sir?
Yes.
Okay. When you told him that if he crossed, I guess it was a line by a boulder, is that right, sir?
I'm sorry, it was a line by what?
There was a line sort of by where a boulder was. That's where you drew the line and said, if you cross this line, we're going to hit you with the beanbag?
Correct.
That was sufficient to keep him, to stop him from approaching the officers. He stopped doing that after you drew that line and said, we're going to hit you with the beanbag. Isn't that right, sir?
No.
Mr. Boyd was told that the weapon that was pointing at him, and let me see if I've got a picture of that. I think I need one of the other ones for that one. Let me show you some marked, admitted as 7C for Sergeant Carpenter. Mr. Boyd was told that this weapon that Chris Wetterlin was pointing at him was a beanbag shotgun, was he not?
I don't know if he was specifically told. I know he was told that he would be beanbagged if he crossed a certain
Yes, sir, and it was pointed out to him that Chris Wetterlin was the one that had the beanbag shotgun. Is that right?
Objection, Pleasant. That's not evidence. I don't think an officer's names were used on the evidence report. In fact, I'm sure.
Well, he was told that this weapon was a beanbag shotgun?
I'd have to either watch video to refresh my memory. The way I remember it, ma'am, is he was told if you passed a certain point, he would be beanbagged. And I recall telling the officers, you know, we'll beanbag him if he crosses a certain
You
point.
don't recall that Mike Monette specifically told him that and that stopped him from coming forward to the officers?
I do know Mike Monette, yes, repeated that.
Okay. And so Mr. Boyd understood that this weapon was a less lethal weapon. Is that right?
Objection, we send calls for speculation.
I don't know if he understood that, ma'am.
All right. Did he seem to understand what being beanbagged meant?
Objection, calls for speculation.
No.
I really don't know what he understood, ma'am.
Okay.
I mean, possibly.
Officer Monette was able to establish rapport to the extent that after the state police arrived, you all stopped pointing guns at him except for the one lethal cover officer. Is that right, sir?
Can you restate that, please, ma'am?
Yes, sir. After the state police arrived, all of you stopped pointing your weapons, or put your weapons away and stopped pointing them at Mr. Boyd, didn't you?
I believe so.
Okay. All except for the lethal cover officer. And let me show you that in 31II. This is after you all have put away, state police has arrived, you see right there, and you all have stopped pointing guns at him except for the lethal cover officer, Brock Nipreth, up in that corner. Is that right?
Sounds about right, ma'am.
Okay. And Officer Monette was willing to stay up there longer and negotiate with Mr. Boyd, wasn't he, sir?
I'm not really sure what you're asking. So there was no conversation between me and him about him, you're talking about him staying up there for longer?
Right. My question to you is, Officer Monette was willing to stay up there longer and continue to negotiate with Mr. Boyd, wasn't he, sir?
Objection calls for speculation.
Did you check in with Officer Monette before he was pulled off to say, you think you can make more progress with this guy?
What do you mean by, as far as him being pulled off, ma'am?
Officer Monette didn't make the decision to walk down and stop negotiating with Mr. Boyd, did he, sir?
No.
He wasn't the one that called it quits, was he, sir?
No, ma'am.
Were you aware that Officer Monette had never had an unsuccessful negotiation with any subject up to that point, sir?
Objection relevant, Your Honor.
You called him down after your discussion with these folks at the bottom of the hill, is that right, sir?
He was called back, but he wasn't called down.
Okay, when you say called back, he was called away from being with Mr. Boyd, wasn't he, sir?
Yes, all of us were, ma'am.
Okay, and here is a picture, I think, of the moment when you all were called down from the hill.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's talk about how Defendant Sandy and rope officers got to the scene. It is unusual in your experience that rope would show up for a situation developing with a mentally ill person, isn't it, sir?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Completely relevant, Judge. It is not the kind of call that rope ordinarily handles, is it?
Same objection, Your Honor.
You did not call for rope officers to arrive at the scene, did you, sir?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
It's directly related to what he was asking him, Judge.
Can you repeat that, ma'am?
You did not call for rope officers to arrive at the scene, did you, sir?
Specifically, no, I called for the tool.
Taser shotgun.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you've already testified you wanted it from the gang unit, requested it from the gang unit at one point. Is that right?
Well, so the reason I know, with my experience being in special investigations, I don't recall rope. There was times possibly, but I don't recall them being on call all the time. And I knew gangs was. That's why I said gangs, because I knew they were on call, and rope didn't necessarily have an on-call. But I know a number of units in SID are trained to operate that tool.
Yes, Sergeant Carpenter, did you ever find out how rope members Sandy and Ingram ended up at the scene?
Objection, relevance.
Do you know if K-9 came to the scene because you called or because Defendant Sandy asked Lieutenant Ingram to call K-9, the K-9 unit?
Objection, relevance.
Were you aware that Defendant Sandy debriefed the K-9 officers before they arrived at the scene about the situation on rope air?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Do you believe, sir, that there are bad apples in every organization?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance can be approached.
Let's talk about the arrival of the rope officers and the canine officers, and I think we already established they arrived together, this group of 3 or 4 of them, including SWAT Officer McFarland. Is that right, sir?
Right.
Your Honor, with this witness, I don't think that's the case. I think she's testifying.
Well, I can show the picture again if you'd like. Okay.
I'll just let the jury know, I'm gonna keep a little bit of time, I don't think it's gonna be very much past before the.
Okay. So Sergeant Carpenter, this is the group of people that arrived together, these 4 here, Sandy, Weimer-Skirch, McFarland, and Ingram, is that right? And Rex here too, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you were called down the hill to talk by Officer McFarland, who's this fellow right here, is that your recollection?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know whether or not the 4 of them talked and came to an agreement together that they would call you down or not? Do you know if that happened?
I don't, ma'am. I know Officer McFarland, who was the one on the radio.
All right. And you don't know if the 4 of them were in agreement or were concerned that you were in an unsafe position up there at the top?
Ma'am, I don't know what was said, because we were a bit, I mean, they were back from us, and I know, Officer McFarland was saying, hey, over the radio to
Come on
attack-
down. So you don't know what they talked about before they called you down, is that right, those 4?
Not specifically, ma'am.
And after you came down, can you tell me who this is a picture that we have from a video of a fellow who was videotaping from his balcony. And can you tell me who, I think we've established this is Officer Monette. Do you know who this officer was that stayed up when everybody else got called down the hill?
I can't tell from that picture.
Okay. When you went down the hill to talk to these 4 officers, by the time that you got down to the bottom of the hill, Defendant Sandy had already traded his taser shotgun for a rifle, hadn't he, sir?
Objection calls for speculation, Your Honor.
I don't remember that, ma'am.
All right, sir, let me find this place just a second. The officers who replaced your field officers that were pulled down, were these same 4 officers? Or was it just the 3 officers here, the 2 rope officers and the canine officer?
When you say replaced, so we were, the field officers started to take up the outer perimeter. And I know that these officers did move up, not to where we were at, but they moved up a little bit closer than, or a little bit further than where we originally were at.
Okay, and those officers who took your place at that point, Keith Sandy, had his rifle rather than a taser shotgun, didn't he, sir?
I believe so, ma'am.
And he had handed his taser shotgun off to the other rope officer. That's this rope officer, Mr. Ingram. Is that right?
Objection, lack of foundation, as he saw it.
Your Honor, I think he did, and I can refer him to his deposition.
You lay the foundation.
All right. The other officer that had the taser shotgun was Officer Ingram, not Officer Sandy. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Did any of these three people, Ingram, Weimer-Skirch, or Sandy, at the bottom of the hill, sit down and debrief with you before they went up the hill about what less lethal resources you had on scene?
Debrief. I don't remember that.
Okay, and did they ever talk to you about whether you had any CIT officers on scene, did they?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Do you know if any of the three of them spent any time talking to the CIT officer, Officer Monette?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
You did not decide to send them to the inner perimeter. They decided they would do that. Is that right?
Yes, the canine handler having the dog had moved up, which I was comfortable with.
And that trio of officers replaced the field officers on the inner perimeter. Is that right?
You still had, that was with them for a moment, was Officer Monet.
Okay.
He was with them at their location, moved up.
Okay. And then at some point did Officer Monette get moved to the outer perimeter?
Yes, that was my decision. Officer Monette was there, and I want to say approximately 20 minutes. I don't know, maybe longer.
Okay.
At that moment.
And at the time that Sandy, Weimerskirch, and Ingram took over the inner perimeter, you were still supposed to be in command of them. Is that right?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
It is right.
Correct.
If an officer you were supervising had time to communicate a plan to you, you would expect them to do that, would you not, sir?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Were you aware that those three began discussing various plans to take Mr. Boyd into arrest about 30 minutes before the shooting?
Objection, relevance.
No, I was not aware.
Okay. Was that enough time before the shooting to inform you of their plan?
Possibly, yes.
Were you aware of their discussion at 7:06 that they couldn't use a taser shotgun with the dog at the same time?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
I'm gonna allow that.
Was I aware that they couldn't use?
No, sir. Were you aware of the conversation between those three officers at 7:06 about how they couldn't use their canine and the taser at the same time?
Your Honor, he's already testified he wasn't aware of their conversations.
Were you aware of their conversation at 7:16 that nothing dynamic was taking place?
No, ma'am.
Were you aware that they had decided at 7:16 to wait until more or less lethal options arrived?
Your Honor, same objections before. He's not aware of their conversations, however.
You're aware that Sergeant Fox, the SWAT sergeant, arrived at 7:20, are you not?
Yes, ma'am.
And Sergeant Fox brought with him additional beanbag shotguns, did he not, sir?
I do know they carry those tools, yes, ma'am.
All right. And instead of waiting for the beanbag shotgun, the trio of Weimerskirch, Sandy, and Ingram moved closer to Mr. Boyd, did they not?
Objection implies facts not in evidence that they knew that the other shotgun, at that point, the beanbags were.
That's not, it had nothing to do with the judge. Okay. After SWAT Sergeant Fox arrived, those three moved up close to Mr. Boyd rather than waiting for the beanbag shotgun from Sergeant Fox, didn't they?
Same objection.
I don't know,
Okay.
ma'am.
Did they tell you or ask your permission about whether they could move up close to Mr. Boyd?
At that time, I was giving a list of tasks to do from Sergeant Fox.
Yes, sir.
So-
So they never asked you for
Uh,
permission?
No, he was in charge at that moment, ma'am.
Okay. And did you ever hear over the radio, hear them ask Sergeant Fox for permission to move up next to Mr. Boyd?
Radio transmission was, I don't remember hearing much. I was told to make a phone call. And so for a moment, I was on the phone, and I don't remember hearing that. No.
Okay. Did those three ever tell you they were going to try to trick Mr. Boyd into picking up his bags and coming down with just the three of them up there?
No.
Okay.
So I'm just going to object to the last question as the answer be stricken because it implies facts that are not in evidence, Your Honor.
They will be judged when Officer Weimer-Scourge testifies.
Sustained.
Okay. At no time between when they took over the inner perimeter and the shooting did Officer Weimer-Scourge or Defendant Sandy ever communicate to you whether they had an arrest plan? Did they, sir?
No, ma'am.
Even after the shooting, none of those three officers ever described for you an arrest plan, did they?
Objection relevance, Your Honor.
And even though you were in charge, you don't know who made the decision to arrest Mr. Boyd, do you, sir?
Can you explain what you mean by arrest Mr. Boyd, ma'am?
Well, sir, it's a question that was asked of you in your deposition. Do you know who made the decision to arrest Mr. Boyd? And your answer was no.
Correct. It was no, but we didn't conduct an arrest. I don't.
Can you tell me which of the three officers between Weimer-Scourge, Sandy, and Ingram were assigned to go hands-on to make the arrest of Mr. Boyd when they approached him?
Objection relevance, Your Honor.
You had some additional options as the sergeant in charge before SWAT arrived. One was to request CNT officers. Isn't that right, sir?
Objection relevance, Your Honor.
The only force you ever threatened to use on Mr. Boyd while he was up there was a beanbag shotgun when you were having a direct contact with him.
Yes.
After Monet told him that you were going to beanbag him if he crossed a line, he stopped crossing the line, didn't he, sir?
Objection, Your Honor.
1 second, John. Thank you, sir. Carpenter.
It'll be quick. You were asked a series, or I think it was only 2 or 3 questions with regard to Officer Monet moving up with Detective Sandy, Acting Sergeant Ingram, and Officer Weimer-Scourge to the location where Mr. Boyd was. Do you remember that question?
Yes. Yes.
And that Officer Monet was with those officers for approximately 20 minutes,
Correct.
and that you made the decision to have Officer Monet move away from those officers. Is that right?
Objection, leaving, Your Honor.
So would you please explain why you made the decision to have Officer Monet move away from those officers and join the other officers on the outer perimeter?
Well, so he was there for a little bit over 20 minutes, and he just wasn't saying anything. When I was watching, K-9 officer Scott Weimer-Scourge was the one speaking with them, and because of the distance, they had to, yell back and forth to each other. But it was kind of the same as each officer. So, I was thinking, well, if Officer Monet's not going to say anything, we can possibly use him on a perimeter position if he's, going to be silent. Plus, I think, so Officer Monet, I think he did a pretty good job. But I do know, being previously CIT trained, you don't promise anybody anything. And there was a couple of promises that were made, which I felt that we couldn't follow through with. And so I made the decision I was comfortable with drawing him back, being from earlier when he was speaking with them, and then him not saying anything and deploying that resource somewhere else.
Those are my questions, Your Honor. Thank you. May this witness be excused, Your Honor?
Yes, thank you for your time.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will recess till 1:30 for lunch. And again, just a reminder not to discuss the case of anyone. so
Yeah.
you're free to stay or go.
The court admitted all of the transcripts, and I guess my concern is,
Wait, which one?
this is the ones that Mr.
Robles
Gibney,
exhibit,
can you tell me the exhibit number, Mr. Gibney? It's all of the transcripts of the taser cam video of Sergeant Carpenter.
That is D4A
D4A,
to D4C.
and I,
and D4B, and I wasn't sure if I had that correct, but that's what I thought Mr. Robles had said, but in my list, I don't have a distinction, I just have it.
I thought I had said, and we have listed on our exhibit list, exhibit B2A through B2C.
D2A?
Yes, that's what I have on our exhibit list, as well as what I recall saying to the court.
D2A, B, and C were admitted, not today, I don't think, previously. Is there confusion about that?
I don't think he can hear it.
Oh, sorry. Exhibit B2A, B, and C were admitted. I don't know what day, I didn't think it was today, but maybe it was because it's Jason Carpenter.
Yes. My recollection is, Your Honor, at the very end of Jeff Stone's testimony, I had asked him the foundational requirements,
Right.
and that's when you made a ruling regarding admissibility as an exception for the business records exception for the rule against hearsay, and that's as far as it got. And then when the
But then this morning, we addressed it through Sergeant Carpenter.
right, and that's the question I want to raise, Judge. Because if we're going to admit every single, the entire audio transcript and the entire written transcript for every taser cam that was out there, you're going to have 10 hours of video for the jury to watch if they want to go back there, much of which is repetitive because there's 2 or 3 people will have a taser cam in the same situation. And that was my objection on cumulative, and I'm wondering if we can just present to the jury the clips that actually get played to them.
That was my understanding based on what Mr. Robles said, that he had taken out the cumulative portion.
Right. So what was played to the jury was to avoid the objection of cumulative, and that's why it's being presented in the way that it is, so it's
So
that
the
not the play.
exhibits themselves are different than what you played?
So it's the entire thing. So I only played clips of the entire thing, but when I presented them through Jeff Stone, it was the entire thing as opposed to the admission of clips. Like Vixen's is a little different than.
Were you requesting to admit the entire thing, or just the clips as I understood?
Our belief was that because this witness had testified, everything that he brought, everything that he videotaped in the transcripts would be admissible into evidence, the whole thing.
Right, and that's my objection on cumulative, Judge, because that's, what we're doing is creating piles of evidence and videotape they haven't heard the entire things of, and you could have them listening to videotapes and audio tapes for 10 hours and they're based on all these
I
transcripts.
overruled the objection because my understanding of what was stated by Mr. Robles was that it was only the portions that were not cumulative. So that's the
So we
theory
will-
under which I allowed them to come in.
So we can make clips that were played in court and then only have portions of the transcript which went along with those clips.
That would be consistent with my rule.
That's great.
You had another issue, Mr. Gordon, or was
Yeah,
that?
the other issue is, Your Honor, I thought you had told the prosecutor the last time not to ask that question that was written down.
I did.
And I thought I heard the question asked at the
You
end.
did. I don't know if there was a misunderstanding. or what.
There was a misunderstanding, Judge. There was a
I
misunderstanding.
said that I was wanting to have you ask the question.
Okay, I'm sorry, Judge, then.